Good morning. This homily was given in 2009, but just recording it now, so obviously it's not during Mass. A family had identical twins. One was a hope-filled optimist, the other a hopeless pessimist. The optimist thought everything was coming up roses. The pessimist was so negative he thought that the Murphy and Murphy's Law was an optimist. The worried parents took them to a psychologist. He suggested a plan to balance their two personalities. He said on their next birthday, put them in separate rooms to open their gifts. Give the pessimist the best toys you can afford and give the optimist a box of manure. After they did this, they peeked in on the pessimist and heard him vehemently complaining, "I don't like the color of this computer. It will probably break." Then, tiptoeing across the hall, they peeked in and saw their little optimist gleefully throwing the bag of manure up in the air. He was giggling and saying, "They can't fool me. Where there's this much horse manure, I must be getting a pony." This story points out how strange it is in life that people can see the same things so differently. It doesn't seem to be so much a matter of people having sight, but having insight. So let's explore the question of our view of the world and how it is influenced by the sight of self-interest versus this insight of God's love. In Mark's Gospel today, blind Bartimaeus begs for his sight and is healed instantly and completely by Jesus' word. But interestingly enough, only 2 chapters earlier, another nameless blind man is healed, but initially only incompletely. He is initially given only his physical sight, but Bartimaeus immediately is given both his sight and, more importantly, insight. There seems to be a natural progression in Mark's Gospel from just physically having sight by Jesus' touch to having insight by Jesus' word. Scripture contains a number of stories about healing the blind. Blindness was very common in biblical times. In contrast, starting in the 18th century until now, there have been very rare occasions when modern medicine has restored sight to someone blind since early childhood. And in all cases, there were similar complications, but only now are we starting to realize what was happening. You may have heard the story of Michael May. When he was a baby, he totally lost his sight through a freak explosion. At age 46, May had his sight restored by a rare and miraculous medical procedure. He is one of only a few who have had their sight restored after a lifetime of blindness. He is also the only person whose experience has been thoroughly studied. The medical results of that neurological study were published in the summer of 2003. It turns out that even though the operation fully restored his visual capabilities, after years now his brain still cannot completely interpret and understand those signals. May still sees the world like an abstract painting. He can't recognize objects in 3 dimensions, make sense of complex landscapes, recognize faces, or interpret facial expressions. He struggles with nearness and distance, such as why one can't touch trees in the distance. He can catch a ball, for example, but he can't recognize his wife's face. He can only tell a cube is a cube if it is moving. He recognizes colors perfectly, but he often can't tell shadows from trees. Basically, May has physical sight but lacks the learned mental wiring for insight. So what relevance does this study have when we hear Jesus say to Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" The question is almost insulting if it is viewed only superficially. The man is obviously blind. He wants to see. But if we go deeper, Jesus was not being insulting. He was calling Bartimaeus to conversion, asking him if he wanted the insight of God's love for him. In asking the question, Jesus is essentially confirming to Bartimaeus and by extension to all of us, that we have freedom to choose. Bartimaeus gets the point. And how do we know he gets the point? Because in answering the call of Jesus, Bartimaeus not only emphatically says, "Master, I want to see," but then he throws aside his cloak. This is a big deal. For a beggar, the cloak is his bed by night and his way of collecting coins by day. The beggar throws aside what little security he has. Clearly, he is asking for insight, not just sight. Then, when he is cured and can see, he chooses to go with Jesus. Bartimaeus gets full insight because he addresses Jesus as Son of God, Son of David, a title reserved for the Messiah, as was prophesied in the Old Testament. So unlike Michael May, who can't recognize his wife and her face, Bartimaeus can recognize Jesus. We cannot see the spiritual world, only have insight into it. So for Bartimaeus, the miracle is complete and is much more wonderful miracle than we could possibly have imagined by superficial thinking. If only May could have had that. Bartimaeus had both sight of and insight into God's love. As with Bartimaeus, God gives us insight into his love in so many ways. On a trip into the country, my wife and I stopped in the forest during a moonless night, turned the car lights off, and looked up at the stars. As we all know, we may have sight in the city, but we cannot see the stars because of the background light. In the country, we can look at stars that are millions of light years away. A light year is 5.9 trillion miles. So multiply that by millions, or the diameter of the universe, 56 billion light years. That is how long light takes to reach our eyes. We are actually seeing those stars as they existed millions of years ago. We are literally looking back in time. This is truly hindsight. And through our ability to reason, we can trust that our own star, the sun, will rise again tomorrow. We can have a view of the future. God has enabled us to look ahead in time. This is truly foresight. If God can give us such insight into the light-filled beauty he has created, so much more so would he be the light to the world by giving us insight into the even greater beauty and expanse of his love for us and within us. He loves us infinitely more than we can ever love ourselves. Bartimaeus knew the magnitude of God's love through his word. As Henry David Thoreau once wrote, "I see beyond the range of sight new earths and skies and seas around, and in my day the sun doth pale his light." In the first reading, God shows his love, especially for the weak, by giving his people insight into how his love is going to lead them to safety and fertile land. In the second reading, God shows his love in the greatest way possible by giving us his Son. God never ceases to show us the way to himself. So how does this relate to the challenges in our daily lives? What questions should we be asking ourselves? Does my employer have a company vision statement? Yet I don't even have a personal vision statement for my own soul. Did I lose my job yet trust in God rather than just myself? Do I have a spiritual confidant, or do I try to go it alone? Just because God is out of sight, is he really out of mind? When I see someone doing wrong, do I judge harshly with selfish insight, or do I love freely with insight from God? When someone gets angry at me, do I respond like the apostles wanted to respond, by getting angry back? Or do I look upon the person's anger as a call for help, like Bartimaeus? Do I really believe that God of light, who made a universe beyond all imagination, could leave us in the dark without insight into the magnitude of his love?